حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر
الله أكبر.
لا إله إلا الله
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
So inshallah, we're going to be speaking about the returning to the Fitra, which is actually Imam Isa, a continuation of it's actually a continuation of the khutbah this morning, inshallah. And it was speaking about the returning to the Fitra in the human destiny, sacrifice, and the meaning of the two Eids. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So my dear brothers and sisters, servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, today I want us to reflect deeply on the human being. And I want us to reflect on who we are and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. So what our life is supposed to become and how the great signs in our religion are not just rituals on the calendar, and they are lessons in human development. Lessons in human destiny and how a person comes out of confusion and comes into the clarity of the mind. And how a person comes out of the appetite and comes into discipline. And how a person comes out of mere existence and comes into purpose. So I want to go into this through the lens of the reflections of Imam Wafdi Muhammad, rahimahullah alayh, on Prophet Ibrahim, on sacrifice, on the social nature, on the human heart, and on what it means for a human being to come into the life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for him, right, for all humanity. Because many of us live, but we are not fully alive. Many of us breathe, but we are not awake. And many of us move through the world, but we have not fully stepped into the destiny that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us. So this is a conscious level, right? So you will see this as a conscious level. You're stepping into a new conscious level. This is what people say when they say reborn again. When you're reborn again, you're stepping into a new conscious level to where you perceive things a different way. So there's a difference between being alive biologically and being alive spiritually. So there's a difference between having a body that walks the earth and having a soul that is awakened with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a difference between a person who is ruled by appetite and a person who is guided by purpose. And one of the deep ideas that comes from this reflection is that the human being cannot stay in the womb forever, right? So the womb is comfort, right? So this is think about a woman being pregnant. The womb is comfort, is protection, and dependency, right? The baby depends on the mom in the womb. So the womb is a place where everything is given to you and nothing is demanded from you. But Allah did not create us to remain in the womb. So Allah brought us forth from the womb into the world because He intended for us to grow, to struggle, to learn, and to build, and to get to know Him, right? To know our Creator is to know ourselves. So to discipline ourselves and to serve others and return to Him consciously. So in one sense, the whole human story is a story of being brought out from darkness into the light, like a seed. When you plant the seed, it's in the darkness, and then eventually it comes to the light, right? It has to be rooted first in order for it to grow upward. Brought out from dependency into responsibility, brought out from instinct into understanding, and brought out from comfort into the destiny. So many people if they could, would rather remain in the womb-like existence. They want a life with no test, no pain, no sacrifice, and no accountability. So no difficult choices, and no difficult choices. They want peace without struggle, and they want reward without discipline. They want nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without surrender to Allah. And they want the sweetness of faith without the work of faith. But Allah has not created the human being for this. Allah created the human being with a fitra. So this is why Eid al-Fitr is here, right? With the fitra, a natural original disposition, a pure beginning, a natural leaning toward the truth, which is your creator, a natural openness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a natural potential for obedience and purity, compassion, intelligence, balance, and moral beauty. So Allah says in meaning, set your face to the religion upright in the fitra of Allah upon which He created mankind. So this means there is something originally sound in the human being. There is something originally right in the human being. Something in us that was meant for the truth. And we were not originally created crooked. We were not originally created corrupted. We were not originally created to be slaves of appetite and slaves of ego, slaves of lust and slaves of this dunya. So in the human being, a created pattern from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that pattern is the fitrah, standing upright. But through the fitrah is given by Allah, right? It still must be protected, nourished, recovered, and returned to. Because life covers it and sin covers it. So this is why we have Eid al-Fitr, right? Every year you have to return to your fitrah, right? So through the fitrah is given by Allah, and it still must be protected, nourished, recovered, and returned to, because life covers it with sin. Heedlessness covers it, and ego covers it. Trauma, material obsession, and the noise of the world, of this dunya. So one of the deepest questions for every believer is not, how do I live? But how do I return? How do I return to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala originally intended in me? And how do I return to clarity? And how do I return to purity? And to soundness? And how do I return to a heart that can receive guidance? And this is where Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr becomes so important, very important. Too often we think of Eid al-Fitr as just a celebration because fasting is over. We dress well, we eat, we greet one another, we smile, we give gifts, and that is good. That is the joy part of the blessing. But if we stop there, then we have only touched the surface. So Eid al-Fitr is not just the end of fasting. Eid al-Fitr is a sign of a return. It's a sign that through hunger, thirst, prayer, patience, recitation of the Quran, restraint, charity, remembrance, and the human being was undergoing a process of the purification. So during Ramadan, you do not simply stop eating. You confront yourself. You confront what controls you, your desires. You confront your habits, the undisciplined impulses. You confront your anger and your weaknesses. And when you fast sincerely, you begin to understand that your body has its natural desires, right? And it has desires too as well. So you have your natural desires of your fitrah, and then you have desires that you pick up based off of what you were taught in this world, right? In this dunya. So your tongue wants to speak, and you do not have to say everything you feel. Your eyes want to wander, but they do not have to consume everything they see. Your anger wants to erupt, but it does not have to rule over your behavior. And your nafs wants ease, but it does not have to sit on the throne. So Ramadan is training. Ramadan is purification. Is a return to order. Ramadan teaches the human being that the body is not the master. The appetite is not the master. The ego is not the master. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the master. So when Eid al-Fitr arrives, it is not merely a feast after starvation. It is a sign that the believer has come through a cycle of purification and has returned to his natural fitra. So at least in some measure, to the original soundness Allah created in him. That is why the joy of Eid is not the joy of indulgence. It is the joy of restoration. It is the joy of being cleaned. It is the joy of finding yourself again under the mercy of Allah, under the rahmah, right? So it is the joy of a human being stepping back towards his natural fitrah. So in this sense, Eid al-Fitr represents the return of the fitrah of the human being. Not because we become angels, not because struggle is over, and not because we have no more work to do, but because through the discipline Allah commanded, we are brought back into alignment. The soul is clearer, the heart is softer, and the mind is more awake. And the body has been taught its place. The person has remembered that it belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the journey does not end with purification. Because once the person is purified, then comes sacrifice. So this is why we have Eid al-Adha, right? This is why our religion gives us not one Eid, but two. And the two Eids are not random celebrations. They teach us two movements in the life of the believer. One is the return, and the other is surrender. One is purification, and the other is sacrifice. One is restoration of the fitrah, and the other is proof that you love Allah more than what is clinging to you, or what you cling to. And that brings us to Ibrahim alayhi salam. So Ibrahim is not just a figure in history. Ibrahim is a model of human awakening, right? Ibrahim is a model of what happens when a human being refuses false worship, refuses inherited error, and refuses social blindness, and rises into conscious submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's called the Imam of all the nations. Because in him we see leadership, a reason, a purpose of being here, a heart, sacrifice, and surrender all comes together. So in the story of Ibrahim and his son, there's a lesson deeper than the outer event alone. The event happened and it is sacred, and we honor it as Allah has taught us. But within it, there is also a language for the soul. There is also a teaching about the human being. So Ibrahim is shown sacrifice. He is brought face to face with what is dearest to him. He is brought face to face with the pain of surrender. He is brought face to face with the question, what do you love the most? And what do you hold the most? And what are you willing to let go for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So this is the point that must be understood carefully. The lesson is not that Allah loves pain for pain's sake. The lesson is not destruction for destruction's sake. The lesson is not that the believer is called to become emotionally dead. The lesson is that a human being can never fully come into his higher life while being enslaved to a lower attachment, to something that's down here in this dunya, right? And we all, inshallah, we all pray for Jannah Firdaus, right? Ameen. So we can't attach ourselves to what's in this dunya, right? So it says something has to be given up. Something has to be surrendered. So remember your fitrah goes upward, it's standing upward, right? So everything has to go up. So something has to give up, and something has to be surrendered. And something in us has to die for something truer in us to live. So it says, and this is where your framing is powerful for the delivery. It says the son can be spoken as representing the life of spirit, which was Ismail at the time, when he was told to sacrifice his son. So the son represented the spirit, the life of spirit, that precious thing nearest to the heart. And the sheep as representing what must we address in the human beings, physical and biological nature. In other words, the story teaches that what Allah wants is not the destruction of the spirit, but the disciplining of the lower nature, and not the killing of what is most noble in man, but the sacrifice of what keeps man beneath what he was created to be. So Ibrahim comes to an understanding. It is not the true son that Allah wants to destroy. It is the lower attachment, the sheepish nature. the merely biological life, when it rules the human being, that must be put in its place, right? The sheep. So this is a profound point because many people live as if physical is everything. Their whole life is an appetite, consumption, image, possession, comfort, pleasure, and fear of loss. But everything is about the body. Everything is about what they can touch, taste, own, and display and protect. Their world is material, and because their world is material, their souls becomes buried under what is material. So this is why a lot of people find confusion nowadays because of social media. You have all of these influences that's going on around the world right now to where people are easily attached to it emotionally, right? So it said that is why the sheep is such an important symbol here. It says the sheep represents the lower passive herd driven appetite governed tendency in the human being, and it represents the human being when he is merely led by instinct, fear, and led by the crowd, and merely led by comfort, and led by what is easiest to the human being. So it is the part of the human being that can be managed by outer pressures because it has not yet become inwardly governed by the truth, by Allah's words, which is the Quran, right? So this also means killing the tendency to tolerate abuse. Because when a human being lives only in the lower sheepish tendency, he can become too passive in the face of what is wrong. He can begin to normalize humiliation. He can begin to accept oppression, and he can begin to tolerate being used, degraded, manipulated, or spiritually beaten down. He can begin to think that surviving abuse is the same thing as peace, but that is not the Fitra Allah created for the believer. So Allah did not create the human being to live beneath the dignity. Allah did not create the believer to make a home in oppression of the soul. Yes, we are patient. Yes, we are disciplined. And yes, we do not answer evil with reckless evil. Two wrongs don't make it right. But patience is not permission for injustice. And humility is not agreement with degradation. Part of sacrificing the lower self is sacrificing the weak tendencies that we all have. It says the believer is not meant to be ruled by tyrannical desires inside, nor tyrannical oppression outside. So when we speak of sacrifice, we must also speak of killing the tendency of tolerating abuse and killing the appetite for unhealthy domination and the inner acceptance of being less than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us to be. So sacrifice in the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam is not just about slaughtering an animal. It is about slaying the dominance of the lower self, and it is about refusing to let the physical nature dictate the destiny of the person. It is about bringing the biological under the command of the moral, and the moral under the command of the spiritual, and the spiritual under the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So whenever he slaughtered the lamb, he was getting rid of the sheep as far as being a part of the physical dynamic of this world and stepping into the spiritual part of this world. So that's why he was told to sacrifice his son. You know, his son was the spirit. So he didn't want to bring the spirit to the people because the people wouldn't understand it from a spiritual. They only understood things from a physical dynamic. So it was bringing people to a whole nother, like people say, reborn again. Bringing people to a whole nother conscious level to think from a spiritual realm rather than just this physical realm that we all see here. So this is why Eid al-Adha is not simply a celebration of meat. It is not just a memorable of a past event. It is not just a memorial of a past event. It is a living lesson that surrender requires cause. The believer must give something up the believer must prove that he loves Allah more than the comfort, more than ego and more than an attachment, more than fear and the possession of things, more than even the most emotionally gripping parts of his worldly existence. So it says, Eid al-Fitr teaches us the restoration of Fitra through purification. Then Eid al-Adha teaches us the protection of the Fitra through the sacrifices that we make for ourselves. So because purification without sacrifice does not last, a person can leave Ramadan feeling clean, and if he refuses sacrifice, he will go back to his old chains. He will say, I want the sweetness of faith, but I do not want to give up what poisons my heart. He will say, I want to be nearest to Allah, but I do not want to sacrifice my pride. He will say, I want a pure life, but I do not want to let go of my secret sins. I want Allah to honor me, but I do not want to surrender the things that degrade me. But the past does not work like that. Fitra is recovered through discipline, and Fitra is guarded through sacrifice. So this is why we have the two Eids that belong together. That's why I said it's not just a ritual, right? It's something that's very dear to us. So Eid al-Fitr come back to what Allah made you to be, and Eid al-Adha says, now prove that return by what you are willing to lay down for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is your sacrifices in this dunya. And when we understand these two together, we begin to understand the religion not as random rituals, but as a complete education for the human being. So it is teaching us how to think correctly and how to feel correctly, how to order our love correctly, and how to discipline our biology correctly, how to use the material world without worshiping the material world, and how to honor the body without becoming the body, and how to live in society without being swallowed by society, and how to have desires without being ruled by them, and how to have power without becoming arrogant, and how to have emotion without becoming blind to it. So this connects beautifully to the idea of the heart, because the heart is central in all of this, right? The heart is not merely an emotional organ in our language of faith. The heart is the center of orientation. It is where love is ordered, and it is where meaning is received. It is where the intention is formed, and it is where corruption spreads, where purification begins. So if the heart is sound, the life begins to line up. If the heart is diseased, the life falls out of line. And if the heart worships dunya, the person becomes fragmented. If the heart is turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the person becomes together. So the whole movement of the believer is the movement of the heart back toward its proper qibla. And once the heart is rightly oriented, the rest of the life can be built correctly. This is why people who seem to have everything materially can be miserable. And because the heart is disordered, the soul is disordered, and the loves are disordered. And this is why a person with less dunya can sometimes have more peace, and because something inside has been put back in its rightful place, which is his natural fitra. So this is what Eid al-Fitr is. So inshallah, I'll let that be the first part of this khutbah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bismillah. So, this is not an abstract, right? This is real life. This is reality. So every one of us has something physical, lower, egoic, and her-like, which is fear-based, appetite-based or dunya-bound that must put on the altar. And until it is, we will keep feeling the contradiction inside of us. We will say we love Allah, but live for ourselves. We will say we want Jannah, but cling to what drags us downward. We will say we want purity, but protect our impurities. And we will say we want to grow, but defend the very things that keeps us childish. So Ibrahim's story is not far away from us. It is happening in us. The question is, what in me must die so that what Allah intended in me can live? What must I stop feeding? What must I stop protecting, excusing? And what must I stop calling just how I am? What must I place before Allah and say, oh Allah, I love you more than this? This is sacrifice. So inshallah, I wanted to touch base on, it was speaking about the light, and then I'll end the khutbah here, because we don't have too much time. So it was said the relationship between the light, perception, and deception, right? So our perception on things is how we perceive, how we look at things, right? How we look at the sky, how we observe the nature, how we observe each other, right? And then we have the deception. Deception is something that brings you downward, right? That's taking you away from your natural fitra. Your fitra is going upward, right? So deception is obviously bringing you down, right? So this is where it says, because one of the dangers the Honorable Wafdi Muhammad pointed out in his reflection is that Shaitan does not always call the human being directly to darkness. It says sometimes Shaitan calls the human being toward what looks like the light. And this is one of the greatest trials of the human mind and the human heart. So Allah created light as guidance, and He created light as clarity. And Allah created light so that we may see what is real. And Allah says in the Quran, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. This is Surah An-Nur, right? Ayah 35. It says, this means that all true guidance, all real illumination, and all meaningful clarity ultimately comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Comes from upward, right? So, but Shaitan seeks to distort how we approach the light. So he wants the human being to become fascinated with the light for the wrong reason. So I was speaking about the nature of the moth, right? You see the moth consistently goes back to the light. And I was speaking about it with Imam as well, and he said that particles of the moth falls off as it gets closer and closer to the light. And then it'll go away from it, and then it'll go right back to the light, but what it's doing is it's killing itself without even it knowing. Right? So it says he wants the human being to become fascinated with the light for the wrong reason, and he wants the human being to seek light not to understand creation, but to seek light in order to exalt the self. So the desire to get too close is a spiritual metaphor. Reflect on something very simple. Allah placed the sun at a precise distance from the earth. If the sun were much closer, life would be burned. If the sun were much further, then life would freeze. But balance is what allows life, and distance is what allows benefit. Measure is what allows growth. And then itself is a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, English translation, it says, indeed, we have created everything according to a precise measure. So the human being benefits from the sun, not by trying to become the sun, not by trying to rush into the sun, but by living within the balance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set between us and the sun. So this becomes a powerful spiritual teaching, because Shaitan wants the human being to exaggerate his perception of himself. He wants the human being to desire what does not belong to him, and he wants the human being to want power that was never meant for him. He wants the human being to step outside the limits of Allah. And this was the very deception he used with our father Adam. Allah tells us in the Quran, then Shaitan whispered to him, right? So that was the whisper, that was the waswisu. So he said he did not force him, he whispered, he planted a thought, he planted a suggestion, and he planted an exaggeration. So light that helps you see and light that blinds you. The Honorable Imam Wafdi Muhammad taught something very deep here. He said, light helps you see, but too much light directly in your eyes can blind you. This is not only physical, it is spiritual. So the believer is not meant to chase the light, is self and arrogance. The believer is meant to see what the light reveals. The believer is not meant to try to become the source. The believer is meant to benefit from the source. Then it says, there are people who want knowledge for humility, but for superiority, to be over, to be above somebody, right? So it says, people who want power, not for service, but for domination. This is what you see today. So people who want spiritual experiences, not for obedience, but for ego. This exaggerated perception of the self. This is the whisper of the shayateen. So he was mentioning something about God is dead. This is like how they want everyone to think about. It was like a concept of how people will think today, right? God is dead. God is not here. Which is you bring the word of Allah to somebody, people say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want this. It's too much. You're too spiritual. You're too this. You're too that. So it's killing the name of Allah, right? It's putting it out so that people won't come into their minds to be able to think on a higher note of how the human being should think, because we were given the intellect, right? So it says, and when human beings lose proper orientation to light, they begin to lose the orientation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There was a time when society began loudly declaring ideas like God is dead. But what does that really mean? It does not mean Allah has died. Allah is al-hayy, the ever-living, right? It means that in the minds of many people, Allah has been removed from purpose, removed from the daily life and decision-making. Seriousness and religion becomes more entertainment. Faith becomes symbolic and worship becomes cultural. And once Allah is removed from purpose, human beings begin to worship themselves. This is exactly what the shaitan wants. Because shaitan's crime was not ignorance, it was arrogance. So Allah says, he refused and was arrogant. In Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 34. It says, arrogance is not only thinking you are better than others, arrogance is stepping outside your created place. Arrogance is wanting to be what only Allah can be. So it says, march against what Allah does not approve. So the believer must develop the courage to march against what Allah does not approve. This does not mean hatred of society. It means clarity with society. It means a heart that is not controlled by the trends, right? So remember when I spoke about the sheep. So don't be amongst the sheep. Be the shepherd that leads the sheep, right? And that's able to. You're supposed to be able to have the treat one another as if you're a part of the sheep, as far as the sincerity, loving one another, and being amongst one another. But whenever you're supposed to step away from that, is when you step into the spiritual realm of things instead of looking at the physical. So you being away from the sheep, away from all of the sheep, is you thinking on another dynamic, which is the spiritual realm that Allah wants us to think of is the higher intellect, which is our natural fitra, is to think upward. Think upward. This is where we get our information from. This is where the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes from, right? So don't think like the sheep. Treat each other like the sheep, but don't be like the sheep, in a sense. So man was not created to escape the world completely. He was created to prepare himself spiritually so that he can return to the world and deal with it correctly. This connects directly to our earlier reflection. Ramadan purifies you, Sacrifice strengthens you, and now clarity must guide you. And I'll end it here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار.
آمين.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. إقامة الصلاة.